Welcome back to Penguin Classics On Air. Fab Five Freddy is a hip-hop pioneer and in the 80s was a cultural liaison between New York's downtown art scene and the burgeoning world of hip-hop in Harlem and the Bronx. His subway car tribute to Andy Warhol is a graffiti art classic. He appeared in Blondie's groundbreaking 1981 music video, Rapture, in which Debbie Harry immortalized him with the lyrics, "Fab Five Freddy told me everybody's fly." He produced, composed, and starred in the first hip-hop feature film, Wild Style. His 1982 Change the Beat is one of the most sampled and scratched hip-hop singles in history. Fab Five Freddy was the first host of Yo! MTV Raps. He has directed numerous music videos and co-produced the film New Jack City. When did you first meet Keith Haring, and what do you remember about him as a young artist?
We met at the Times Square show. I was at the Times Square show to install some paintings up in one of the exhibit areas, and Keith wandered in. So I recognized who he was, but he didn't really know who I was at the time. Now I remember. And so when he came into the room, he had heard that Lee Quinones, who I was collaborating with at the time, and Fab Five Freddy, Fred Brathwaite, was going to be hanging some paintings in the room. So Keith saw me and Lee in the room, walked over to me and Lee and said, and our paintings were on the floor. They hadn't hung them yet. They were my paintings. And Keith said, "Do you know who these guys are? These are great artists. These guys that are about to hang these paintings on the wall." And me and Lee looked at each other like we thought he was joking because, this was my work. But he thought, let me tell these guys what's going on. And he was explaining who we were to us when somebody working with the Times Square show walked in and said, "Dad, so is this okay?" And then Keith looked and said, "Oh, my God, let me take my foot out of my mouth."
You and Keith were in an exciting time for creative exchange among artists from the hip-hop, punk, and downtown art scenes. What were some of the most memorable creative events that you and Keith were involved in together?
At Club 57, he asked me to put some music together for a show he was curating. It was a black light art show. And I got Africa Bambaataa to come and spin records, which was his first time leaving the Bronx to come downtown and play music. Because Bambaataa had all kinds of music. He had funk, he had rock, he had obscure songs that people didn't know, but they loved as soon as he played them. So I got to put together music as well as be in that blacklight art show. And then there was another show, but then the biggest one was the guy who owned the Mud Club, a guy by the name of Steve Mass, had started to get wind that the graffiti thing was starting to happen, and I was one of the key people in the middle of it. So he asked me to come and curate a show at the Mud Club, and Keith had already curated a show there, a little small show, and so Keith assisted me, but I was the curator of the show, and it was called Beyond Words. The subheading of the show was graffiti-based, rooted, and inspired works. So we had graffiti artists themselves, people inspired, or people's work that was rooted in graffiti. So that included a lot of the kind of newer, younger artists like, ourselves, Kenny Sharp, Keith Haring, Jean-Michel. I even included rock people like Alan Vega from a group called Suicide. And then there were people like Crash and Pink and Futura, etc. That show was huge at the Mud Club. And then I had a whole array of hip-hop artists like Bambaataa, like Busy B, people that you see featured in my movie Wild Style, all came to perform. And that was the beginning of hip-hop culture really getting, introduced to the downtown scene. And it was a really huge art event covered in the Daily News. It was a big deal.
As a fellow artist and friend, what struck you most about Keith in terms of his interest in creating art for the public?
That, he learned a lot from what graffiti did as kind of public art, if you will, those examples of it that were clearly artistic. And Keith had a very populist attitude about balancing art for the public as well as, art for the collector and the museum and the gallery, and very conscious about walking that line and making that happen, which he was able to do. And the big murals that he would paint which were primarily inspired by the work of Lee Quinones, the guy that, when I first formally met Keith, he was the first to paint huge handball court-sized murals in Lower Manhattan. And anybody that saw those things were completely in awe. And Keith, when he developed his style of painting, he realized that if he was going to be able to paint on that scale, and so he would later do that all over the place. Yeah, and also I just wanted to point out, I think another little interesting caveat, I was just telling my two assistants, I was the person that first took Keith to the very far east side of Avenue D and beyond one summer night. I guess it was around 1980, 81, and we discovered there was a school on East Houston Street, and we could smell spray paint. Well, I smelled spray paint. I was like, wait a minute, somebody's painting. And we walked all around to figure out where this smell of paint was coming from. And then we saw there was a way we could get into this courtyard of the school. And when we got into the courtyard, there was several graffiti artists have been painting a huge mural all around the circumference of this pretty sizable courtyard. And Keith went crazy, loved it, and he started talking to the guys because there were young graffiti artists that Keith would see their tags. Like when we would walk around, things that would catch his eye or catch our eye, he would be curious about. He would ask if I knew who that was or could I decipher it, and sometimes yes, sometimes no. But there was one guy in particular whose name was LA2, and Keith saw that tag as a part of the murals in this courtyard, and the guys connected him with LA2. He said, man, I'm really a fan of this guy. The next day they met and began a collaboration which was very pivotal to Keith's early work. As I'm sure you know, him and LA2 made a sizable body of work together, and that was like an epiphany for Keith because in the tone of the streets then, which was really rough, really aggressive, and it was kind of dangerous, if you will, Keith met somebody on the other side of the tracks that he embraced and became close with, and it was an amazing thing to see Keith really work with these people, make sure they got paid and got their due and all of those things. So that was very pivotal to him at that early point.
We've asked Jeffrey Deitch to describe what makes Keith Haring a classic, and what I'd love from you is a short list of what you and Keith would consider classics from that era, songs or places or any specific cultural phenomenon from the 80s which continue to inspire artists today. What would be on your short list?
I mean, Keith loved all the hip-hop records that were emerging at that time. So that included anything on Sugar Hill Records, which were the first records widely heard and distributed, Rapper's Delight, and a whole host of others. Of course, I was the one that introduced everybody to a lot of that music. Anything that you could really dance to and have fun with, Keith loved. On the new wave punk side, there were groups more than records that we loved. The B-52s, the Talking Heads, anything very danceable and stuff like that. Not just songs that were just pure hard rock or hard punk. We were more into things that we can dance to. And then for Keith, that would, of course, move into dance music, of course, and the beginnings of house and all that stuff, which he became very passionate for and would have mixtapes, that you can work to and just keep that vibe going continuously. There was a non-ending stream of great music around us wherever we went and accompanying whatever we did.